The rules that kept nuclear weapons in check are about to disappear. In early 2026, for the first time in more than 50 years, the world's two largest nuclear powers could be operating with no binding limits at all. No inspections, no enforced caps, no shared framework. The system that quietly prevented worst-case thinking is simply scheduled to end. Here's the contradiction. Publicly, both sides still talk about restraint. Calm language, measured signals, but the machinery that made restraint real has already stopped working. Inspections are gone, data exchanges are gone. What once ran on law now runs on assumptions. This matters to you because nuclear stability isn't theoretical. It shapes how leaders react under pressure. It decides whether crises slow down or spiral. And when decisions are made in the dark, planners don't assume the best. They plan for the worst. Now notice what's changed. This isn't a collapse triggered by one dramatic event. It's the result of systems quietly switching off one by one while everyone pretends nothing has broken. And once you see how that happened, what comes next is far more dangerous than it sounds. What's happening now didn't start with a deadline on a calendar. The expiration in 2026 is just the moment everything becomes official. The real shift began earlier, when the system stopped functioning but stayed on paper. Participation was suspended, verification froze. The guardrails were still there, but no one was actually touching them. Here's why that framing matters. This isn't about one treaty ending, it's about a pattern where rules exist, then hollow out, then quietly vanish. And each stage feels survivable until suddenly there's nothing left to rely on. On paper, limits still exist. On paper, numbers are still respected. But in reality, the structure that made those numbers meaningful is gone. That creates a strange new zone where stability is no longer enforced. It's inferred. Ask yourself this: if you can't verify what the other side is doing, are you still being restrained, or are you just hoping they are? Because that question changes everything. It shifts planning, posture, and perception. And once perception changes, behavior follows. This is where the story flips from technical to strategic. And the next layer reveals why this moment doesn't stay quiet for long. There's a claim sitting at the center of this moment that sounds reassuring but hides real risk. The claim is that nothing dramatic is happening, that both sides are still following the old limits, that stability is holding. And technically, that's true. Deployed warhead numbers haven't suddenly spiked. Launches haven't visibly multiplied. On the surface, the balance looks familiar. But here's the detail that changes everything. The system that proved compliance is no longer operating. No inspections, no shared data, no on-site confirmation. What used to be verified facts are now educated guesses. That matters because strategic planning doesn't run on optimism. It runs on uncertainty. And when uncertainty grows, planners don't ask, what is the other side probably doing? They ask, what could they do if they chose to? Notice what's missing here. There's no mechanism left to resolve doubts before they harden into assumptions, no forum to quietly clarify anomalies, no routine process to drain suspicion before it spills into policy. So stability hasn't disappeared. It's become fragile. It now depends on voluntary restraint and signaling instead of obligation. And when restraint becomes optional, the incentive structure changes. Because the moment one side suspects preparation, the logic of waiting collapses. Now watch how fast this escalates once incentives start shifting. Once incentives start shifting, normalization follows. What would have been unthinkable a decade ago begins to sound practical. Planning for expansion becomes prudence. Hedging becomes responsibility. And slowly, the idea of operating without limits stops sounding extreme. This is how arms races restart. Not with announcements, but with internal adjustments. More options on the table. More warheads kept in reserve. More delivery systems treated as insurance instead of excess. We've seen this pattern before. During earlier periods of rivalry, the absence of constraints didn't create immediate explosions. It created accumulation. Stockpiles grew quietly, postures hardened, every move justified as defensive, every response framed as necessary. What's different now is the context. This shift is happening in a world with faster weapons, compressed decision timelines, and less diplomatic trust. Yet the removal of limits is being treated as a manageable transition rather than a structural rupture. Here's why that's dangerous. Once something abnormal becomes routine, reversing it becomes politically costly. Leaders stop asking how to restore limits and start asking how to compete better without them. And at that point, restraint is no longer the default, expansion is. This is where the story stops being about a treaty ending and starts being about a system accelerating. The second proof is more unsettling because it exposes a contradiction between language and behavior. Publicly, the message remains calm. Officials talk about stability, they talk about responsibility, they insist nothing has fundamentally changed. But look at what's happening underneath that language. Plans are being made for a world with no ceilings. Systems that were once constrained are now being discussed in terms of flexibility and upload potential. Capabilities that sat quietly in reserve are being reevaluated, not for reduction, but for readiness. Here's the line that permanently shifts how you see this. When limits disappear, restraint stops being strategic and starts being conditional. It lasts only as long as both sides believe they are not falling behind. And notice what's not being said. No one is clearly committing to staying small in a world where the other side is free to grow. No one is locking in restraint beyond the next political calculation. The language of voluntary adherence sounds cooperative, but it comes with an exit ramp built in. That contradiction matters because it means stability is no longer anchored to rules. It's anchored to mood, perception, and fear of surprise. And fear is not a stable foundation. Once decision makers internalize that reality, the logic shifts again. The question stops being whether to expand and becomes how fast. This is the moment where quiet tension turns into momentum. Now the pressure starts stacking. Not one crisis, but several moving at once. Limits are fading, verification is gone, and planning timelines are tightening. Decisions that once unfolded over years are being compressed into months, sometimes weeks. That speed matters because systems built for slow negotiation don't adapt well to rapid shifts. At the same time, new capabilities are being layered in. Missile defenses expand, offensive systems adapt. Each development is framed as defensive, but each one forces the other side to respond. The cycle feeds itself. Then add politics. Leaders rotate, rhetoric hardens, commitments made by one administration don't bind the next. In that environment, long-term restraint starts losing to short-term advantage. This creates a sense of drift, followed by loss of control. No single actor presses a red button. Instead, momentum builds through routine decisions that feel reversible until they're not. And here's the dangerous part. Once multiple pressures stack at the same time, there's no clean pause button. Everything keeps moving, even if no one fully likes the direction. So ask the question that now sits at the center of this moment. At some point, this stops being abstract and starts touching everyday life. Not in headlines about megatons, but in quieter, more personal ways. You feel it when defense budgets swell and priorities shift. When money flows toward weapons instead of stability, trade-offs follow, infrastructure waits, social systems strain. The ripple effects don't arrive labeled nuclear, but they're connected. You feel it in crises that escalate faster than they used to. When leaders operate with less information and more suspicion, decisions harden early. Diplomatic pauses shrink. Military signals get louder. The margin for misreading intent narrows, and you feel it psychologically. A world without guardrails creates background anxiety, even if no one talks about it directly. Uncertainty becomes normalized. The idea that catastrophe is unlikely but no longer unthinkable seeps into public consciousness. This isn't about ideology. It's about living in a system where fewer breaks exist on the most destructive power humans have built. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments, because recognition matters. It tells you this isn't just theory, it's lived experience. And once ordinary people start feeling systemic pressure, the story moves into its most revealing phase. To understand why this keeps happening, you have to look past personalities and focus on mechanisms. Systems don't collapse because people suddenly become reckless. They collapse because incentives quietly realign. In a constrained world, power is managed through predictability. Limits reduce fear, transparency slows reaction time, but once constraints weaken, leverage shifts. Uncertainty becomes a tool, ambiguity creates advantage, and signaling replaces structure. Here's the unsettling insight. In an unconstrained system, appearing strong can matter more than being stable. States are rewarded for flexibility, not restraint, for options, not ceilings. The absence of rules doesn't create freedom. It creates pressure to demonstrate capability before the other side does. This is why outrage misses the point. No one needs to want escalation for it to emerge. The system pulls behavior in that direction on its own. Leaders respond to incentives, not ideals. And notice the trap. The longer this environment lasts, the harder it becomes to reintroduce limits. Trust decays. Technical frameworks atrophy. What once took months to negotiate now takes years. That's how systems lock into dangerous trajectories without a single dramatic decision. And once that lock-in happens, the future narrows fast. From here, the path forward splits, but neither option is clean. One path looks calm on the surface. No immediate build-up, no dramatic announcements, just continued voluntary restraint, held together by signaling and habit. In this version, leaders convince themselves the risk is manageable, that nothing forces a change today. But the stability here is thin. One shock, one misread move, one rapid technological shift, and the balance snaps. The other path moves faster. Limits fade, and planning adapts openly. Warheads are uploaded. Delivery systems expand. Each side tells itself it's responding, not initiating. The logic is familiar. Better to be ready than surprised. But once this path begins, stopping feels like weakness. Momentum replaces choice. What makes this moment dangerous is that both paths can exist at the same time. Restraint publicly, acceleration privately. And the longer that contradiction holds, the more likely it is to resolve violently. Notice what's forming here. Decisions aren't being made in isolation. They're being shaped by expectations about what comes next. And expectations are already shifting. The next move may not be announced, but it's being prepared. And that brings us to the final question this story forces into view. Here's the insight that reframes everything. The danger isn't that someone suddenly chooses chaos. It's that a system designed to prevent it is quietly switching itself off. For decades, nuclear stability depended on limits that slowed fear, forced verification, and bought time. As those limits fade, time disappears. Decisions speed up, assumptions harden, and the space for correction shrinks. This story isn't about the end of one treaty. It's about what happens when restraint becomes optional in a world built around worst-case thinking, when power is managed not by rules, but by momentum. What comes next won't arrive as a single headline. It will emerge through small moves that feel reasonable on their own, but irreversible together. If you want to understand how that next phase takes shape and where the real pressure points are forming, follow and subscribe, because this isn't the end of the story. It's the point where it starts moving faster.